Great to have you back for week 9 of our Pole 3 IPC journey. In this video, we're going to examine the international relations implications of deglaciation on sea level rise and international river systems. Sea level rise and deglaciation driven by anthropogenic climate change is a grave challenge for the peoples and states most vulnerable to these phenomena. They also problematise some of the core norms and practices of international relations. I'm going to spend the first half of this video looking at sea level rise specifically. So I'll start out looking at the causes and impacts of sea level rise and the state sovereignty implications. I'll look at climate-driven population displacement and how sea level rise interacts with climate migration. In the second half, I'll look at terrestrial deglaciation and how water resource cooperation and international riparian treaties fit into this picture. Global mean sea level has risen by about 3.4 millimetres per year on average since 1992, and that figure's rising. Now this might not seem like much, but over time this is likely to have an increasingly significant effect on human societies that are located in coastal areas. The graphic on the slide here shows the vulnerability of various major cities around the world. Sea level rise is driven by 3 primary factors, and these are the melting of glaciers and land-based polar ice cap, the thermal expansion of the sea, and local land subsidence, and these 3 things can interact. Because of this complex causation, the degree of sea level rise does vary according to location. Sea level rise expresses itself in 3 primary ways, and these are encroaching high tide marks, storm surges, and saltwater intrusion of fresh water resources. Now, a tidal high water mark or strand line is the highest position of the tidal cycle on the coast. So structures that are built directly on the foreshore will become increasingly vulnerable to regular tidal buffeting as the high tide mark encroaches with rising seas. Storm surges occur when strong winds from extreme weather events like cyclones, hurricanes and typhoons push at the ocean surface, causing water to pile up higher than the ordinary sea level. So at the coast, storm surges push seawater well inland beyond the regular high tide marks. In low-lying areas, storm surge events can contaminate freshwater resources. So surface and groundwater reserves are both vulnerable to saltwater intrusion, and this is a problem that's particularly acute in small island countries. The economic and social costs of sea level rise vulnerability are clear to see. Hundreds of millions of people worldwide live in coastal settlements large and small, and many of these people will probably be forced to move. People pay premium prices for waterfront real estate in some places, which, like fossil fuel infrastructure, are likely to become stranded assets. In other places, people with livelihoods that are dependent on trades and industries linked to the sea will also be vulnerable to loss of income. Critical infrastructure that's located on or close to the coast, like port facilities and airports, power stations, oil refineries, urban transport systems, and even agricultural land, all of this infrastructure is vulnerable when sea levels rise. Contemporary international relations is based on the concept of state sovereignty, which is the ability of a state to exercise control over a defined territory and the people and the resources within that territory. Now, it's relatively easy to stake out state boundaries on land using all manner of fences and walls, border posts and military installations. However, states can also claim sovereignty over parts of the ocean. Here, in the maritime environment, it's more difficult to delineate boundaries, and these boundaries are often hotly contested and subject to dispute. Oceanic territorial claims are governed by an international treaty called the UN Convention Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS for short. Under UNCLOS, there's 4 different levels of sovereignty that states can exercise over their adjacent seas. The first 12 nautical miles from the coastline are a state's territorial waters, in which it can exercise full sovereignty, where the state has full control over resource exploitation and where all national laws apply as they would on land. To illustrate, here's a map of Australia's territorial waters, and this map is from the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. There's other forms of maritime claim once we progress further than 12 nautical miles out to sea. The sea area from 12 to 24 nautical miles from the coast is called the contiguous zone. And in the contiguous zone, states relinquish full sovereignty, but domestic regulations in customs, taxation, immigration and pollution remain in force. But things get interesting once we go further out from the contiguous zone. So from 24 nautical miles out to sea, UNCLOS includes two competing means of claiming maritime sovereignty. So on one hand, a state can claim an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, up to 200 nautical miles from the shoreline. Here, a state can claim exploitation rights over natural resources in the water column of the sea, on the sea floor, and under the seabed. So usually this relates to fishing rights and rights to exploit oil and gas deposits under the seafloor. By way of illustration, this is Australia's EEZ claim. In addition, a state can also claim rights over its continental shelf, to the end of the continental margin where the shelf drops off into the ocean. Now, a continental shelf claim can extend to either 200 nautical miles offshore or to wherever the shelf ends, whichever is greater in extent. In contrast to an EEZ, a continental shelf claim entitles a state to exploit resources on the seabed and under the sea floor, but not in the water column. If we look at a map of Australia's continental shelf claim, notice how it's different from the EEZ map, because the continental shelf around Australia extends further than 200 nautical miles from the territorial baseline in many places. Now here's the rub in terms of sea level rise. So maritime boundary claims are measured from a terrestrial baseline that conforms more or less to the geographic contours of the coast. In states with island archipelagos, this baseline is measured from the outer edge of the islands, and the waters between the islands are considered internal waters. And you can see this clearly illustrated here on this graphic of the Canadian territorial baseline along its Arctic marine frontier. If rising sea level changes the contours of the coastline, then inevitably the associated maritime boundaries have to change as well because the territorial baseline has moved. And this can present some problems. So because of the strategic and economic potential of undersea resources, maritime territorial claims can often take decades to negotiate, and many claims are contested and remain locked in dispute. Countries in these disputes often press their respective claims through hostile posturing and displays of military power. And these can sometimes develop into shootouts and possibly even armed conflicts if any of the disputing parties miscalculate. Now, the present-day maritime disputes between China and Japan over the East China Sea and China and a number of Southeast Asian countries over the South China Sea are cases in point. And you can see the map of the disputing claims of the South China Sea dispute pictured here. Now, in both the East China Sea and the South China Sea, there are significant oil and gas reserves up for grabs. So, by altering maritime boundaries, sea level rise has the potential to reopen existing territorial and resource sharing agreements for renegotiation. And why is that? Because realigning the boundaries means redistributing the potential resource gains, which potentially complicates already complicated existing disputes and opens up settled disputes to renegotiation. Sea level rise is one of many different climate change impacts that could force people to move from where they live and create additional vulnerabilities for those who stay. On average, one person's displaced each second by a disaster-related hazard worldwide. So in global terms, that's about 26 million people per year. And as climate change continues to escalate, more frequent and extreme weather events are expected to put more people in harm's way. And we have to also distinguish between rapid onset disasters like storms and flooding, which have different implications for human mobility compared to slow onset events like desertification or drought. Climate-related factors also have different impacts on international, regional and internal migration. And this is because migration is a complex phenomenon, and there's different kinds of push and pull factors and different forces that influence migration flows. Social, economic and cultural processes can combine with climate-related triggers to shape patterns of human mobility and also immobility. Internal displacement within states is the most common form of climate-related migration. So this map here from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre shows the extent of internal population displacements worldwide. Also, the most vulnerable people in climate situations are frequently those who can't move at all and are compelled to stay in place. This graphic shows the routes and the relative magnitude of global migration flows. So climate change impacts are likely to turbocharge these existing migration flows, which is an illustration of the threat multiplier effect that we touched on in week 7. From a climate perspective, you can think of population movements as flows from areas of low adaptive capacity to high adaptive capacity. International law doesn't generally regard people displaced by disasters as refugees, and national responses tend to be ad hoc and unpredictable, which results in protection gaps for people that are displaced by climate impacts. There's no clear legal definition for environmental refugees in the Convention relating to the status of refugees of 1951, which from here on we'll call the Refugee Convention. So under the Refugee Convention, a refugee is legally defined as someone who's crossed an international border owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. The graphic here offers an illustrative time series comparison of the top 20 refugee source and destination countries since 1992. Now note that Australia's numbers as a refugee destination country are incredibly small and they don't warrant a mention on this list. Displacement by climate change impacts doesn't fit within the legal definition of a refugee under the Convention. The Convention doesn't provide legal protections and it doesn't provide rights of asylum for climate displaced people. And given the toxicity of asylum seeker policies around the world, including here in Australia, that lack of legal protection is highly problematic. But what about when permanent displacement is the only viable adaptation option? Let's consider the migration dilemmas faced by people in low-lying island states in the face of sea level rise. So for countries like the Maldives, Kiribati or Tuvalu, sea level impacts are already placing these countries under threat. The graphic here shows the member countries of the Association of Small Island States, or AOSIS. So these countries formed as a negotiating bloc in the UNFCCC due to their common vulnerability to sea level rise. In the short term, the governments of low-lying countries can employ adaptive measures like ocean barriers to cope with rising seas. In the longer term, though, these adaptive responses are likely to become too expensive and then completely ineffective, which might leave migration as the only viable option for these people. Relocating to a new country and to a foreign culture is always difficult, especially in the absence of support networks of friends, family and community. So because of this, many people in island countries are choosing to stay. For them, migration would be an absolute final option, and understandably so. The great tragedy of these forced migrations will be the loss of unique cultures. National cultures around the world are heavily invested in landscapes, heavily invested in place, in the land in which each people inhabit. Yet the big question here is, how can a culture be preserved in the absence of its link with the land? How can a nation be preserved if it doesn't have a homeland? Cultural preservation is therefore a pivotal issue for island societies that are facing the threat of sea level rise, as it is for any people anywhere whose culture is intimately entwined with the land. The nation ex situ is a proposal to reconcile the existential threat of sea level rise to small island states with the inadequacies of the regimes of international law that are pertinent to refugees and state sovereignty. So to respond to the phenomenon of landless nation states, international law could accommodate an entirely new category of international actors, which Maxine Burkett, who came up with this theory, calls the nation ex situ. Ex situ nationhood is a status that would allow for the continued existence of a sovereign state, afforded all the rights and all the benefits of sovereignty in perpetuity. In practice, this would require the creation of a government framework that could exercise authority over a diffuse people who could be spread as a diaspora population across the world. A political trusteeship model could be used to provide the framework for ex situ nationhood governance. In 2012, the Nansen Initiative on Disaster-Induced Cross-Border Displacement was spearheaded by Switzerland and Norway to begin work on addressing this glaring gap in international migration law. The Nansen Initiative's chief outcome was something called the Protection Agenda, and this provided a toolkit of concrete policy options and effective practices that governments can use to implement both to avert displacements where possible and to protect and assist those who do end up being displaced. The Nansen process led to the establishment of a new initiative in July 2016 in the Platform of Disaster Displacement. So led by the governments of Germany and Bangladesh, with Australia also as a founding member, the Platform on Disaster Displacement addresses how to protect and how to help people who are displaced by the impacts of disasters and climate change and to prevent future population displacements. Devising new legal arrangements in international law to deal with the challenge of sea level rise to the state sovereignty norm continues to be a work in progress. However, there is a proto-emerging new refugee regime that's been forming through and also in concert with the Nansen process. And this has been addressed in a number of instruments that have popped up over the last 10 years. So these include the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Agenda for Humanity, the Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Task Force on Displacement, which was established within the Paris Agreement, and most recently, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. So these arrangements recognise the need for cross-sectoral coordinated action to address the diverse and region-specific challenges of human mobility in the context of climate change. Ultimately, it all comes back to building adaptive capacity, implementing long-term socioeconomic regeneration projects is required to enhance community resilience and building capacity for self-help. Disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation strategies can help to mitigate against population displacement in vulnerable states. Temporary planned evacuations can provide a pathway to safety and can provide emergency support to get people out of harm's way. And in migrant receiving countries, governments do need to develop more predictable humanitarian and temporary stay arrangements to assist those who are displaced internationally by climate change impacts. So all of this work is happening now, but it's still taking shape. There's a lot more work to be done. So I want to move now away from sea level rise to look at terrestrial deglaciation. So deglaciation, this is not just about the melting of polar ice sheets, but also about the melting of the world's mountain glaciers. Warming global temperatures are melting polar and alpine glaciers that supply fresh water to the bulk of the planet's river systems. So the satellite photo here is of the Himalayas, which is flanked by the Tibetan Plateau to the north and the Indus, Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers to the south. And I'll get more onto the importance of this region shortly. Climate change is significantly affecting the river systems of the world through its impacts on the hydrological cycle, which you can see illustrated here. Across many regions, the seasonality of rain and snowfall is becoming more erratic, punctuated by flash floods and long droughts, intense storms and heat waves, all of which are becoming more frequent and more severe. So you're getting variable stream flows in river systems, which risks upsetting the timing and the quantity and quality of freshwater resources that are available to ecosystems and the communities that are embedded in them. In the short term, the global warming trend is also increasing seasonal meltwater runoff as mountain glaciers melt more quickly, which increases risk of springtime flood events. In the long term though, insufficient water supplies are impairing agricultural production, they're going to endanger public health, strain established settlement patterns and jeopardize livelihoods. Populations that are living along many of the major river systems in the global south are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts on water. The larger graphic in the slide here illustrates all of the major glaciers along the Himalayan mountain range. The smaller graphic in the top right illustrates all of the river systems across East, Central and South Asia that are fed by these glaciers. So these river systems provide water for nearly 3 billion people. So you can see the extent and the implications of the problem right there, just looking at these maps. Riparian states, which means states that share an international border along a river, have tended to negotiate cooperative agreements for managing shared river systems. Globally, there's two complementary treaties that govern cooperation on transnational river systems. So these are the UN Convention on the Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses and the UN ECE Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes. Beneath these two conventions sit a number of regional multilateral treaties for joint management of specific river systems. So these regional agreements have been particularly successful in the global south, including agreements in the Zambezi, Mekong, Jordan, Ganges and Nile river basins. Past cooperation, though, doesn't necessarily mean that water politics will be conflict-free, particularly as climate change impacts become more pronounced. Increasing demand for water from population growth and development interacts with decreasing supply of water due to climate change. The actions taken by upriver countries like dam construction or the excessive drawing off of water for irrigation have significant ramifications for downriver countries. So for example, in the Mekong Basin in Southeast Asia, which is pictured here on the left, many riparian communities have long contested the construction of large hydroelectric dams, particularly upstream in China. Likewise in West Asia, which is pictured on the right, dam construction and unilateral irrigation have altered the flows of rivers in the Tigris-Euphrates basin, shared by Turkey, Syria, Iraq and Iran. And this adds to the complications of an already inflamed politics in this region. As pictured here, the contested borders between China and India along the Himalayan frontier to continue to be a site for low-level conflict. This area combines water politics with contemporary nationalism and the legacies of the British imperial occupation of India. But as we saw in those previous graphics, the Himalaya is a strategic prize given its importance as a water resource to so much of Asia.